Hey everyone, Aaron here from A2Z Strength, and welcome to the A2Z Strength Show. Episode 7 features Dr. Anna Lembke. She's a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine, and she is the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medical Center. Dr. Lembke sits on the board of several state and national addiction-focused organizations. She's testified before various committees in the United States House of Representatives and Senate. She keeps a very active speaking calendar and maintains a thriving clinical practice. She is an accomplished author, with previous publications being Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, Why It's So Hard to Stop, which was highlighted as the New York Times as one of the top 5 books to read and understand on the opioid epidemic. Dr. Lembke recently appeared on the Netflix documentary The Social Dilemma, where they had an unvarnished look at the impact of social media on our lives. She is most famous, and where I came across her work is from her book Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. This book was an instant New York Times bestseller. Dopamine Nation explores how to moderate compulsive overconsumption in a dopamine-overloaded world. Now, this kind of topic along dopamine, or our pleasure-pain response system, is hugely fascinating to me. I'm really fascinated by what kind of drives our motivation or our habits and behaviours, and this topic is hugely influential in that. And Dr. Lembke's work is truly amazing, with the way she kind of highlights certain traits or certain examples of dopamine-seeking behaviour, whether that could be addiction or compulsive behaviour. It's something that is all that we're faced with in all societies, and the majority of us all have some form of compulsive or addictive behaviour trait that doesn't necessarily have to be focused on a drug-induced state as such. And once we understand how these impact on our lives, we can actually start to work with it and explore ways to actually stop these compulsive habits impacting on our life, which is the kind of space that I'm really fascinated in. So this talk was awesome. I got a lot out of it, and I was really quite fortunate to get her, because she has done some amazing kind of talks over the years with some quite high profile people. So to have her on my show is I'm quite grateful for that, and she was very open with her time and the information she came across. So you'll get a lot of information out of this, and how you can kind of apply that to your everyday life, which is really important. And like me, I hope you take a lot of notes, because there's a ton of gold nuggets to take away from this. So episode 7 featuring Donna Lembke. Enjoy, and thank you very much. So Dr. Anna Lembke, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Why do you think your book, Dopamine Nation, has been so successful?
Well, it's a good question, because I'm very surprised that a book that basically says pain is good is something that's resonating for people. I think the time is right. I think we've had a kind of a progressively indulgent culture with more and more messages around, this idea that we all need to be happy and comfortable and insulate ourselves from pain. And we're finding after 100 years of this, that people are less happy than ever before, in more pain. And so I think people are really ready to consider different options.
It seems that the more choices, the more options, the more avenues of comfort we have, the less unhappy we become.
The less happy we become. Yes, absolutely. That this sort of constantly seeking comfort and constantly getting to choose what we feel, when we feel it, at every minute of the day, is not making us happier. And is in fact making us pretty miserable. And so I think there's this recognition, okay, failed experiment, it's time to try something new.
Do you think from a evolutionary point of view, we're made to struggle?
Absolutely. And it's very clear when you look at the neuroscience of pleasure and pain, that the way that we process pleasure and pain in the brain, and the way that we're reflexively evolved to approach pleasure and avoid pain, was really evolved for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, and not for a world of overwhelming overabundance. But the fact that we live in a world of abundance means that this mismatch between our primitive wiring and the modern ecosystem has led to all kinds of problems.
So how do we, got the $1 million question, how do we kind of navigate in a world where we have everything in us? Do we try and give ourselves periods of time where we have scarcity? Is that like the key, to give ourselves those periods of pain or scarcity as opposed to just always having the abundance in us?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of go right to the punchline, that's exactly right. I think we need to intentionally invite a kind of a new form of asceticism and acknowledge that we were not evolved to constantly meet every single need and then some, but rather, we're evolved as strivers. And that if we don't have something to strive for, we're unhappy. And so in a world of abundance, what we need to do is sort of simulate scarcity for ourselves, and find ways to engage in healthy pain so that we can be more aligned with our natural physiology, and therefore help our bodies be in balance both with ourselves and the environment. Not the environment we've created, but the environment that we should be creating if we're going to preserve our planet for the long term.
I love that concept of healthy pain because I'm very big on that as well. But what does that actually kind of mean, and what is healthy pain?
So this is a whole branch of science called hormesis. Hormesis is Greek, and it means to set in motion. And what this branch of science has shown is that if you expose an organism to mild to moderate doses of toxic stimuli, you actually make that organism healthier. So, for example, if you take an organism, even as primitive as a fruit fly, and you expose it to extremes of temperature or extremes of movement or oscillation, or you starve an animal for a period of time, obviously not so much that the animal dies, but a moderate amount, that animal will actually be healthier and more robust than the same species or cohort of animals not exposed to that toxic stimuli. So it's a very really interesting branch of science, showing that we actually need a certain amount of the right kind of environmental stressors in order to tell our bodies to upregulate feel-good hormones and neurotransmitters like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, our endogenous opioid system. And that in the absence of those healthy stressors, we experience a different kind of stress, which is the stress of overabundance.
How do we know that we don't get to that point where we kind of overtip that scale from, say, eustress to distress? Is it a psychological viewpoint of what we're experiencing, or is it like a duration?
So it's a good question. You mean like how much pain is too much pain?
Yeah. How do we know when we get to that point where it becomes more toxic for us as opposed to positive?
Well, so this concept of getting addicted to pain, addiction, broadly speaking, is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. So the bottom line is, if we're exposing ourselves to so much pain that we're essentially injuring ourselves or engaging in a way that's compulsive and toxic for ourselves and other people, then we need to worry that we've gone too far.
I loved in the book I think from me personally why it was probably been so good for society, and it's why it's been so popular, is because the stories that you had in there were so kind of raw and so honest that it gave us quite a differing view of potentially what we thought addiction was. And what you were just talking about then, one of the examples you gave was the man that was kind of turned his addiction into cold exposure.
Right. So essentially I talk about how, addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior. And generally we get addicted to pleasure stimuli, intoxicants, Netflix binges, food, sex, all kinds of things, in addition to drugs, traditional drugs like alcohol and cannabis and methamphetamine, cocaine, but that we can also get addicted to pain. And this individual had gotten actually into recovery from an alcohol and cocaine addiction, and then sort of, accidentally discovered that ice cold showers had this similar impact on him, where he felt sort of high after these ice cold showers, which was a wonderful respite from the kind of suffering that he was enduring, having just stopped his drugs as he was trying to get into recovery. So initially it was really good and helpful. And I actually prescribe ice cold showers to my patients who are trying to stop an addiction.
You're speaking my language there.
Yeah, just because, exercise, ice cold water, and anything that requires effortful, painful engagement over a period of time basically is the science of hormesis, right? It starts to upregulate, we tell our bodies, oh, this is an injury, I need to start making my own dopamine. But obviously you can take it too far. And so he did, in the sense that after a while he got like a meat locker that he would fill with ice cold water. And then, he'd get in it and then he wanted to find a way to lower the temperature. So he got a little motor that kept the water circulating, that kept it colder longer. And then he had this mattress, this ice cold mattress that he would sleep on at night. So at some point he kind of, actually, in talking to me, he sort of, well, it's starting to sound like an addiction, something that he couldn't really see because, he's prone to getting addicted to things. So then he had to go sort of think about whether or not that had become a new addiction in his life. But I think ultimately it really hadn't. So it could have, but I think he was aware enough and using it in an intermittent way. It's harder to get addicted to painful stimuli than it is to get addicted to pleasurable stimuli, because you have to endure the pain up front. Although definitely we do see people addicted to things like exercise.
One thing I've been thinking about the last few days coming into this is, how does stress and dopamine production kind of interact with each other? Because obviously going, say, for gym training or going into a temperature-induced environment, whether that's cold or hot, is because the dopamine response is after the fact, after our stress response system is upregulated. Can dopamine be released while our stress response system is high, or is it only after that drops?
Those things are happening simultaneously. So biological stress is defined as any deviation from homeostasis, and homeostasis is our baseline physiology. So whether we engage in something highly pleasurable or something highly painful, we're deviating from baseline. When we do that, and any deviation from neutrality or from homeostasis sets off our stress response, our own cortisol or adrenaline. So those things are happening simultaneously. But again, we're wired for a modicum of stress. You don't want it to be too much stress for too prolonged a period of time, but no stress is also not good. We need a certain amount of healthy stress in our lives in order to, be healthy.
From your work, this is something, again, I think about from my own personal experience. Are we more addictive seeking when we're under stress?
So there's a very famous series of experiments in rodents showing that if you put a rat in a cage with a lever, and the rat presses the lever and will get an injection of cocaine in its bloodstream, it will essentially continue to press that lever until it's exhausted or until it dies. But if you stop the flow of cocaine or other drug with the lever press, eventually that behavior will extinguish, which is to say the animal will eventually realize, oh, there's nothing good coming my way from doing this work. I'm going to stop pressing the lever. If you then expose that animal to a very painful foot shock, the first thing that it will do is run to the lever, even though the behavior was extinguished, and it'll start to press the lever again. So the latent memory for the drug and where to get it stays in our brains forever. And with exposure to stress, one of the immediate reflexes in response to that is to go to the source of that drug in order to try to counteract the stress we're experiencing. Which is why people who live in very stressful circumstances are more likely to use drugs and to get addicted to drugs. We see soldiers in combat in all kinds of situations, using more drugs, getting more addicted to drugs. And oftentimes, after returning from the war zone, in many of them, most of them, their quote unquote addiction spontaneously resolves. So there's a very famous experiment looking at Vietnam soldiers, US soldiers in Vietnam, many of whom got addicted to opium while they were in Vietnam. And for the vast majority, 80-90% of them just spontaneously resolved once they were back in the United States. And there was not easy access. So access really matters too. That's a big risk factor. And this was the 70s, before our opioid epidemic and our prescription opioid problem that's marked the last 20, 30 years of of the United States history of drugs. But stress is definitely a trigger. It's also a trigger for relapse. So if people have been addicted and then get into recovery and then have a severe stressor, that, they have to put sort of precautions in place to make sure that, they don't relapse under those circumstances.
So I'm just thinking about that when you're talking about the people who have been addicted, who are clean, and then get stressed and go back into the addiction tendencies, does the onset of your stress response system kind of then trigger a cascade internally of then dopamine, and then they think about the pleasure response and then go for that? Is that kind of how that works?
I don't think that the mechanism has been elucidated. All we know is that if you subject an organism to stress, and the organism has previously been exposed to a drug in an addictive way, that stress, and even once you've extinguished that behavior, that stressor will immediately recall the behaviors that were related to the addiction.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you actually explain what dopamine is? I know it's a very hugely very, very kind of question there, but it probably gives a lot of clarity on what we're trying to actually expand on.
Yeah, so dopamine is a chemical that we make in our brains. It's a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are molecules that bridge the gap between between neurons, which is called the synapse. So neurons conduct the electrical impulse that goes from neuron to neuron that creates the circuits that makes us, who we are. But those neurons don't touch end to end. There's a little gap between them called the synapse, and that synapse is bridged by molecules called neurotransmitters. Dopamine is one of those many neurotransmitters, and it's the most important neurotransmitter for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in that process, but it's probably the final common pathway for all reinforcing drugs and behaviors. So different drugs work by different molecular mechanisms. Alcohol works on the endogenous opioid and GABA system. Stimulants work on norepinephrine. But at the end of the day, they all release dopamine in this very specific circuit of the brain called the reward pathway.
And in terms of the pleasure pain balance, I've heard you talk about that as like a seesaw.
Yeah.
That if we head more on the pleasure side of thing, we actually need some pain to bring us back to homeostasis. And then on the inverse of that, if we are experiencing pain, we would need to experience some pleasure to then balance that out. Can you expand on that, please?
Yeah. So one of the very interesting findings in neuroscience in the last 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. So the same part of the brain that processes pleasure also processes pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So if you imagine a beam on a central fulcrum, when we experience pleasure, it tilts one way, and pain, it tilts the other. There are certain rules governing this balance, and the first and most important rule is that the balance wants to remain level. This is what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And with any deviation from neutrality, whether to the side of pleasure or pain, our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance. But here's the key. In order to restore a level balance, our brains tilt an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus was. So let me walk us through that. Let's say we ingest an addictive drug, an intoxicant, alcohol, cannabis, cocaine. We release dopamine in the reward pathway in the reward circuit, and our balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than the brain adapts to that increase in dopamine by downregulating our own dopamine transmission, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels. You can imagine that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it there, so they stay on until the balance is tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the hangover, the after effect. Eventually, they hop off and homeostasis is restored. But the bottom line message is that for every pleasure, we pay a price, and that price is pain. Sometimes it's fleeting and outside of conscious awareness. We eat a peanut and there's that urge to eat another peanut. It's very hard to just stop with one peanut. What is that urge? That's those neuroadaptation gremlins on the pain side of the balance. And so it's a natural impulse when you're over here to want to reach for that drug again to get back to homeostasis, because one of the overwhelming physiologic drives of all living organisms is to restore homeostasis. The way that our brains do it is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus was. So that applies to pain too. If the initial stimulus is pain, like exercise, those gremlins hop on the pleasure side. They like it there, so they stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pleasure. So we get our dopamine indirectly, right, by paying for it up front.
That's fascinating. Do we get a different dopamine, release from different types of experiences or substances? So in terms of, say, like on our phone, social media, as opposed to a substance dopamine hit, is there a huge difference in how we experience that?
The biggest difference is how much dopamine is released and how quickly it's released. The more that's released by a certain drug and the faster it's released, the more we get a tilt to the side of pleasure and the more reinforcing or intoxicating it is. Now, it's very important to really recognize this concept of drug of choice. So what might be really reinforcing and release a lot of dopamine for you might not release very much dopamine for me at all. And so that's really important, that, it's kind of a lock and a key effect. It's like if that drug is the key to your lock, you will find it extremely reinforcing.
Yeah, I could imagine, like, for me personally, I've come from a diagnosis of ADHD when I was younger, and I've found that I'm very much on, could be, I've never been addicted to substances in my life, but I feel like I could be. I have the tendency of being able to gravitate towards something, and for me, it tends to be work. So I can work on a project, I can work on something that is pressing for hours upon hours. I can just solely focus on that, and I can feel actually internally that I'm getting like a dopamine hit from the search or the creativity of doing that.
Right.
And I know a lot of people are like that, and I think we can look at addiction from a point of view that it has to be a substance or it has to be something else. But for me, I can definitely see it. It comes from probably a place of lack in my life that I'm then striving to push myself, which then brings out the thought that I'm getting something at the end of it, which could be actually probably exactly what drugs does to people.
Yeah. So your particular wiring and temperament means that you're vulnerable to addiction to pain, right? You're not that vulnerable to intoxicants, but you're somebody who's vulnerable to overpressing on the pain side, which is how you get your dopamine indirectly, which is in general a healthier way to get your dopamine, but also can fall prey to the same types of compulsive overuse that drugs can. I talk about people sort of getting addicted to their to-do list. There's a constant to-do list. And if they're not getting something done or moving forward on their to-do list, they feel anxious, they feel uncertain. They want to get back to, they're basically kind of jonesing for their drug, just like an alcoholic is thinking like, what time is it? When can I reasonably and socially acceptably start drinking again? It's quite similar.
That actually resonates with me, because I am kind of like that, having things to tick off, because I feel like that I'm actually making progress. But the more I understand that, I think that's coming from a place of lack, that I'm feeling like that I'm not where I need to be. So I'm putting internal pressure to want to gravitate towards something.
Right. And so that sort of gets into this sort of existential or spiritual or psychological things behind the addiction, which I think are important to explore. But I think we can also sometimes make the mistake of overemphasizing that and looking too much for, okay, well, why am I addicted? Well, part of why we're addicted is just because we're wired to get addicted. And now we live in an addictogenic world where everything has been drugified. Even work has been drugified, right? Now it's 24/7. There's no stopping point for work. You can do work anywhere, anytime, and you're almost expected to.
It's like a badge of honor.
Yeah. And now we have social media where we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people. Oh my gosh, look at that person. Look what they did, feeling less than no matter what we accomplish. Even those really accomplished people that we aspire to become look around and say, oh gosh, he's got more money, or she's got, whatever it is. So it's the whole culture kind of conspires to make us all, addicted.
How do we as a society move forward to actually move in a better direction to where we're heading? Because I know in the documentary that you were with for it was on the social dilemma. That was
Right.
that really started to put things on the forefront of people's knowledge. Like, how do we kind of keep this progress moving forward? Because society's tailored on the opposite side of this, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is really the dark side of capitalism. Like, capitalism has been so successful across the planet, and there are many good things about it, right? The meritocracy, promoting individual achievement and innovation. But the dark side of capitalism is that we're all ultimately consumers, right? And the more we consume, the better the society. And at some point, that the whole machinery is sort of moving us all toward addiction. So I think to some awareness of how to just that it's happening and that it can happen to anybody. You know, if you haven't gotten addicted yet, it's coming soon to a website near you. And we have to learn how to temper that.
I loved your concept of dopamine fasting.
Mm-hmm.
How can we explain what that is, and then how can we actually incorporate that into our life?
So the dopamine fast is abstaining from our drug of choice long enough for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for dopamine homeostasis to be restored. We're all always firing dopamine in our brains at a kind of baseline tonic rate. And what happens with repeated exposure to our drug of choice is that we essentially reset our hedonic or joy set point such that that dopamine firing gets chronically lowered. And that's akin to a state of depression, anxiety, insomnia. So by abstaining from our drug of choice for long enough, essentially we go back to our healthier baseline, which gives us access to enjoy more modest rewards that are not related to our drug of choice, and also to see true cause and effect. So in general, that's what I recommend to patients who are coming in, not just for problems related explicitly to addiction to a drug or to a behavior, but also people who are anxious, irritable, depressed. Many times they're spending a lot of time on their devices, consuming a lot of these digital drugs, which is causing their anxiety, depression, and insomnia, but they don't see it. So it's a matter of deciding, okay, what's my drug of choice? Is it this video game? Is it this social media app? Is it pornography? Is it, cookies? Is it cannabis? Is it cocaine? And then eliminating that for 4 weeks, because 4 weeks is the average amount of time it takes to reset reward pathways. Knowing that in the first 2 weeks, I'm going to feel worse before I feel better. This is probably the single most important communication I'll have with patients, is to warn them that they are going to feel worse before they feel better. Why? Because all of those neuroadaptation gremlins that they've been accumulating on their pain side of the balance are now going to be there unopposed, and they're going to experience the universal symptoms of withdrawal, which again are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving, which usually manifests as intrusive thoughts of wanting to use. All the reasons why it's so important that I get back on my phone or my device, even though I told myself I was going to abstain. So when it comes to digital drugs, most people, because of their work, can't completely get off, but they can delete certain apps, right? They can say, I'm not going to go on social media. A good thing to do is to plan it in advance, set a specific quit day, let people know you're not going to be available for this period of time, so you don't then have to rationalize going on because, oh, they're going to be worried about me, or they don't know where I am, or, let your friends on Discord know, hey, I'm not going to be playing video games for a month, or I'm not going to be on Twitter for a while, or whatever it is. And then, enduring the withdrawal, this is where hormesis is really useful. I usually recommend ice cold water exercise during early recovery, because what's happening when those gremlins are on the pain side is if you do something that's more painful than the pain of withdrawal, you'll actually convert those gremlins to go over and hop on the pleasure side, and you'll speed up that process of restoring dopamine homeostasis. So, and then when people, if they're able to make it to a month without using their drug of choice, two things. First of all, people generally report feeling a lot better, less depressed, less anxious, less distractible, more able to sleep, more able to concentrate, and having fewer intrusive thoughts of their drug of choice. But the other real big piece of it is sort of a moment of clarity or insight where people are able to connect the dots between their drug and the way that they're feeling and realize, oh, I thought that watching Netflix every night was sort of my reward and what made me feel better. But it's only after I stopped that evening routine and instead went for a walk that I realized that actually Netflix, although in the moment feels so good to escape into this fantasy world, was actually contributing in the long run to me feeling down, anxious, not able to sleep.
I know a lot of people will be listening to this, and people I've talked to, they always, when I've talked about this kind of topic, or people who will be listening to this, they'll be thinking to themselves, I'm not addicted. There's nothing that's in my life that I gravitate towards. What kind of questions would you ask people that would then give them answers that they kind of would be able to understand what addiction may mean in their life?
Well, first of all, addiction is a spectrum, right? So, it's true that not everybody who deals with compulsive overconsumption would meet, strict criteria for having an addiction. And addiction is a pretty severe form of psychopathology, but almost all of us can identify a substance or behavior that we consume more of or more often than we would really like. And that once we start it, we have difficulty stopping, or that maybe we're lying about on the edges about how much and how often we're doing that behavior or ingesting that substance. I think almost everybody can identify something like that. And so this dopamine fast is not just for people with severe addiction. In fact, it might even be better suited for the sort of the average person struggling with compulsive overconsumption in the world that we live in today. And I think it can just be really instructive to just take a month. Less than that is typically not enough to reset reward pathways, but taking a full month abstaining from that drug, whether it's sugar or Snapchat or even online chess. I've been hearing from a lot of people who feel like they've gotten addicted to online chess because they've turned online chess into a drug, right? These games have gotten shorter. Now there's celebrities, social media.
Probably monetary rewards.
Yeah, you can play with anybody, anytime, all over the world. So increased access. So, changing it up, right? Keeping the brain guessing, stopping that drug for a while, letting yourself reset reward pathways. It's just a very instructive experiment, really, for people to do on themselves. And some people will do it and be like, well, I don't really feel that different. It's like, okay. But a lot of people will do it like, wow, you know what? I feel better.
So what we could do is say, if we feel like we have compulsive tendencies towards certain foods or social media when we're, say, stressed and we want to maybe work with that, you're saying for 1 month, we want to restrict that, replace that in the first few weeks with something healthy. So whether that be cold water, movement, training. And then at the end of 4 weeks, how would you recommend people integrate back into experiencing what their overconsumption was previously?
Right. So first of all, let me just emphasize that during the dopamine fast, you don't want to replace the thing you gave up with another intoxicant. So a lot of times that's what you'll hear. Oh, just replace one reward with another. If you're trying to give up cookies, then you can replace it with, YouTube. But in general, I don't recommend that because there's the big risk of cross addiction, that once you're addicted to one thing, you're more likely to get addicted to another type of easy reward. And instead to do things that are hard or painful. And that's really the counterintuitive piece that we've been talking about. So when we talk about, it's not just when we're talking about healthy replacements, I'm talking about things that are actually kind of hard and effortful, is a kind of counterintuitive way to get through that period. And then when people get to the 4 weeks, assuming they feel better, and most people do, most people want to go back to using their drug of choice, but they want to use less. They want to use in more moderation. So then it's a matter of using self-binding strategies to put barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice so that we can really have a better chance of not falling back into that compulsive overconsumption. And barriers, they can take many different forms. You can have actual physical barriers where, let's say, I power the phone down at a certain point in the evening and I don't turn it on again until a certain time in the next morning. Or I might say, okay, I'm not going to turn my phone on or open my device until I've exercised, made my bed, eaten breakfast, brushed my teeth. And then I'm going to wait and I'm going to create a to-do list of what I'm going to do on my device. I'm not going to deviate from that to-do list. So things like this, where we kind of put barriers in place so that we are cultivating a healthier relationship with our drug of choice, whatever it is.
Are these tools that you've integrated with your raising of kids? Because I know you've got 2 boys, is that correct?
I've got 2 boys and 2 girls.
So how have you navigated all of this, being a parent and knowing all of this?
Right. So we do a lot of talking about the pleasure-pain balance and the neuroscience. My kids know all about that. And then we do a lot of sort of modeling this behavior ourselves, trying to limit our device use. We have tech-free family time. We take tech-free vacations. We're not on our, in fact, my husband doesn't even have a smartphone. I have one that I use just for travel, really. So we're not on our phones a lot. So we're trying to model the behavior that we want our kids to exhibit. And it's been interesting to see because, out of 4, we've got one who, as a teenage girl is never on her phone, not on social media, and has really kind of adopted what we're trying to model. And we've got 3 others who are on their phone a lot, and are sort of more like the average teenager, but probably not the average teenager. I think our kids really do try to limit their use because we really encourage it as a kind of a family ethic, that it's important not to get lost in the world of screens. So, but it's tough. I mean, all of us struggle.
Yeah, it's something me and my wife think about all the time. We've got 2 young kids. So I've got a 5 and a 3-year-old boy, but we're almost due with our 3rd in the next few weeks. So we think about, thank you. Yeah. We think about how we're going to integrate this all the time.
Well, that's good. I think it's good to be thoughtful and to have the conversations. In general, what I do recommend is that children under the age of 12 not have their own devices, and that any time that they do spend on the computer or on a screen be monitored, because there's a whole world out there that kids can be exposed to much earlier than they should be. And so you want to make sure that you know what they're doing. And also, it's not just the content, but it's the quantity of screen time. It's really important to limit it. And I think for younger children, limiting it to a couple hours a week is about what it should be. I don't think it should be daily use. I think once you're getting into daily use, you're getting into, neuroadaptive brain changes that are not healthy for these kids. And then when they get to be, tweens and teens, and they start to get their own devices, whether or not you get it for them, they will go out and get their own. I can tell you that speaking from experience. Then you want to have a lot of conversations about, what appropriate use of the internet and virtual space is. And kids are different. Like some kids can handle it and kind of self-regulate, and other kids really can't. And for the ones who cannot self-regulate, we as parents really need to step in there and help them.
So self-regulation is a hugely important thing that we need to instill in our children, but also be able to instill in ourselves as adults.
Yeah. Right. We have to really model what we want. We can't, I have a lot of families come in there and they're like, my kid's always on his phone. And like in the middle of the conversation, they're on their phone. It's going to be really hard to make progress if we are not modeling, the kinds of digital and tech relationships that we want our kids to have.
Why 12 years of age? Is there something developmental that's going on that below 12 years of age, they may not be able to handle, or the brain is still developing in a way that they shouldn't be experiencing screens or social media? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, really, the whole pruning process where we cut back neurons we're not using and myelinate the neurons that we're using most frequently, that goes up until age 25. And it really begins around, age 12 or 13 or so. But really, this is more cultural. I find that it's sort of like the age of consent. By 12 or 13, at least in the United States, kids they're just up to their own devices. And that's, you sort of had your chance. Like, you can kind of instill in them your values, what you expect of them, what's appropriate conduct. You can instill that you want them to tell the truth. So even if they, go against what the kind of behaviors you expect of them, that you want them to be honest about it. But essentially by 12 or 13, I just find, at least here, in the United States, kids are they're going to do what they're going to do. So if you haven't created that kind of platform where they're at least making an effort, it's going to be hard to do that later. Not impossible, but hard.
I was fascinated when you I watched your podcast with Tom Bayou yesterday on the impact theory, and you were talking about honesty and dopamine release. And that being really honest, if you have, say, addictive personalities or addictive traits, insert whatever that means, that being raw and honest is actually a way of being able to deal with that. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. So one of the things I've learned over 20 plus years of seeing patients with severe addiction is that the ones who get into good recovery, they can't lie about anything. It's not just that they can't lie about their drug use, they can't lie about why they were 5 minutes late to a meeting, because once they start to lie, they're very prone to relapse. And that was really fascinating to me. So I started to research why that might be. And I mean, it works on a couple different levels. I mean, one of it is just, if you're not lying about things, then you're more accountable to yourself and others. But the other way that it works is that if you're telling the truth, you're also more likely to create intimacy with the people in your life. We think that telling the truth about the ways in which we've misbehaved or done things we're ashamed of, that if we tell people, they'll go running. But in fact, the opposite happens. They really come closer. And when they do, that intimacy releases oxytocin, which is a love hormone, which then binds to dopamine releasing hormones in the reward pathway. And we get a little hit of dopamine related to that bond. And that's really wonderful. And that's what we really all want. In many ways, drugs are a sort of substitute for that. The other thing that happens is that adults naturally lie. So the average adult tells about 1 to 2 lies per day. Usually these are small lies that we don't even notice. But when we have to consciously work to tell the truth, what's probably happening is that we are activating the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is this gray matter area of our brains right behind our foreheads. It's so important for delayed gratification, for appreciating future consequences, and also for autobiographical narrative or storytelling. And so by activating the prefrontal cortex, which is a key part of this reward circuit, what you're doing is increasing your ability to put the brakes on consumption. You're not letting those dopamines, those gremlins kind of run the show. You're really saying, wait, no, we're going to put the brakes on that.
Is there a big connection between shame and addiction in terms of, and then I guess people who are dopamine seeking as well, do they come from a place of, a lot of them, I know it's a mass generalization, but does shame play a big role in our dopamine seeking tendencies?
Yeah, so shame has a very interesting role when it comes to addiction. First of all, addiction is a stigmatized behavior, and people do feel a lot of shame about those behaviors. And sometimes the shame itself can then drive the addiction, because as people become overwhelmed by the shame that they're feeling about that behavior, in order to escape the pain of shame, they'll use more. And so the drug use then becomes a way to escape shame, which then only compounds the shame. On the other hand, sometimes the shame can act as a real pro-social emotion to get people into recovery. So for example, I had a colleague who said it was the look on his wife's face when she discovered his late night drinking after he had told her that he hadn't been drinking, and the shame that he felt in reaction to the look of betrayal on her face, which is what actually motivated him to really get into recovery for the first time. So shame is this interesting double-edged sword. It's a very powerful, very painful emotion, and it can work both to drive the addiction, but also to motivate people to get out of the addiction.
I've done, I guess I've experienced lots of Gabor Mate's work, or some other kind of guys that, like the Yuho Hari, the Lost Connections guy. I've read a lot of their books, and I've heard you talked about, so they're really big on trauma or connection. And I heard you kind of talk about this the other on a podcast, and I thought it was quite brilliant. Is that a lot of time people can focus too much on, say, trauma or not having a specific thing in their life, and then kind of create a story or an attachment to that, which then can drive our compulsive tendencies. But you were kind of saying that it's not necessarily going to be one or the other. It's like a combination of, say, external factors, environmental factors, psychological factors that kind of bring about all of these tendencies in us.
Yeah, so I think there's, in mental health generally, there's a very dominant narrative now around trauma being the cause of all different types of psychopathology.
It seems to be the biggest, it's like I don't want to say it's like the N word, but it seems to be something that a lot of people are saying is like the root cause of everything in our life.
Right. And, even what we used to consider sort of just everyday suffering is now conceptualized as trauma and as contributing to psychopathology. And I think that the upside of that is this idea that we're eliciting empathy for people in their struggles, but the real downside is that we're colluding with people around this narrative of trauma, which, even if it's true, is not necessarily going to get people to stop their addictive behaviors. What gets people to stop their addictive behaviors is to stop the behavior, and stop ingesting the drug and change the physiology. So sometimes, insight is the booby prize, and very often you can understand why you use your drug, but not necessarily stop using just because you understand. Also, I think there's a real danger of creating, this trauma narrative, even when there's not real trauma there. And so then that then can become sort of, I don't want to say an excuse, but sort of just like translate into a victim narrative that then perpetuates the addictive behaviors. One of the things that's been interesting for me, in working with people with addiction over many years, is that when I see a patient who tells their autobiographical narrative in such a way that it's always somebody else's fault, the problems in their lives, I know that person is very far from getting into recovery. Because when people really get into recovery and really are able to not just stop using their drug, but also get into a better psychological space, they're not telling that story. They're not telling it in that way. Even people with significant trauma, what they're telling instead is a story in which, yes, this happened to me and that person did that thing, but also here's what I contributed to the problem, and here are my character defects, and here's what I could have done differently. And when I start hearing that, then I know we're moving toward recovery.
So that what you're saying is that it's the difference between using blame or taking responsibility for, I guess, where you are right now.
Yeah, and also just how you understand what happened to you, because the way that we tell our stories is a way not just to organize past experience, but also creates a roadmap for the future going forward. And if you tell a story in which you're always the victim of circumstance, you're not going to get out of your addiction, right? But if you tell a story which acknowledges your circumstance, but says, and then I did this, and this is how I tend to respond in a maladaptive way to this kind of, it's like, oh, okay, now we're going to move forward.
I think too, if we always look back in our past for trauma, we're going to find something.
Right. Well, or make up something. That's the other thing, that people are kind of making stuff up now. I mean, I've had many patients over the years who talk about their parents in a way that if you would think that their parents were like the Antichrist, and then I'll meet these people and they're perfectly nice people. And that's just happened so many times that I realize, wow, these people are not, they have a distorted narrative. They're not, it's not really, it's not as close to the truth as it really needs to be.
Yeah, definitely. I know I'm conscious of time. You've got a meeting coming up. So lastly, how do you recommend, or what do you recommend to people when it comes to giving them advice about living a more fulfilled, happy, and a life full of value?
Well, the first bit of advice I give is just to acknowledge that we are living in a drugified world in which even adaptive behaviors have now have the potential for addiction. So things like work, things like exercise, things that we normally equate with a healthy life, they've essentially been drugified. Social human connection, social media has drugified human connection. So to really be aware of that, and to consciously create barriers between ourselves and the drugification of our lives, and to intentionally do things that are hard as a way to get more of a match between our primitive wiring and our environment. So invite pain to the right degree into our lives as a way to restore dopamine homeostasis. So that's something that I really think is really important in the modern world. And then, of course, everything that goes along with finding purpose and meaning, and on a larger existential or spiritual level. That's sort of the next phase of that, and how people can do that.
I love that. Invite pain into our lives.
Yeah, right. Not too much, but just enough to create the kind of friction to meet up with our innate sort of wiring as strivers.
Dr. Anna Lembke, thank you very much for coming on the show.
You're welcome. My pleasure.